Kenny, thanks for joining me today to talk about FinOps culture. There's a lot
Yeah,
of
thanks for.
talk about, sorry, go on.
I'm sorry. Thanks for the invite, Mike. I appreciate it.
There's a lot of talk about FinOps being a sort of a culture change. In your experience, what does a FinOps culture look like? Well, how do you recognize it when you see it?
Yeah, so I think so the data center culture kind of being the previous thing, right? In my experience, the spend or cost is kind of only a topic of conversation occasionally, kind of monthly, quarterly, that kind of thing. And for someone like a developer in that traditional world, hardly ever, right? Unless there's some other product that they have to budget for, because they're really just consuming infrastructure for the most part that's
Yeah.
paid for by other teams. So they don't really have to, so coming into public cloud, having their own space to build their own infrastructure, now they have to be responsible for that budget. So it's kind of a different thing. So in the FinOps culture, they're going to come in and that's going to be totally foreign to them, most likely, unless they come from a really small kind of startup company, I think. But those developers should, in a FinOps culture, they should be keenly aware of the spend and anything that can impact the spend in any way. Their team goals may have, excuse me, objectives that incorporate elements of spend. Their leaders should have their hands around the economics of the product and have a good feel for what the value they're providing back to the organization, and then is their cost commensurate with that value. I think
Sounds
those are
like quite
things.
a sounds like
Yeah,
quite a journey, Kenny, that. I mean, if you've got these
definitely.
developers and engineers and product managers sort of accustomed to a data center culture where they only have to pay attention to cost once a quarter or twice a year or whatever, getting them to the situation you've described where it's sort of on their desk like every day must be quite a challenge.
Right. Yeah. So from that traditional culture, you'll hear things like, and these are things that I think every FinOps practitioner should try to wipe from the vernacular, really. And things that I've heard a lot, or you'll present someone with a potential savings, and then they'll say, well, that's really just a drop in a bucket if you look at the scheme of things. Well, yeah, indeed it is. And when we were writing on hardware that was kind of a 3-year sunken cost, right? That it may make sense to be underutilized, or it may not be a big deal to be underutilized. But when you're in kind of this time utility based cost model, it becomes a lot like turning the lights off when you leave the house, right? Um, Resource utilization and resource uptime and that kind of thing. That's another adjustment. They're everything that they do day to day, the whole design, it should be somewhat focused towards reducing cost or making those dollars stretch as far as you possibly can, right?
Right. So is that a sort of educational process then? If for the FinOps leader who's sort of trying to get this new approach to cost, this new appreciation of variable costs, is it largely an educational thing?
I think so. So there's other adjustments that were made really kind of organically. So when our organization first adopted public cloud, I think that the developers and that whole community were uh, so excited to get their hands on the new stuff and get into the public cloud, because prior to opening the doors, they were shut tight for public cloud. Um, and once they did this whole community developed, right? So there was this collaboration across teams, there was across departments, even there was this Rocket Chat channel that we had, that got devoted to public cloud, and it just blew up. There was people asking questions, quite happy to go back to the community for help with technical issues, and other people happy to answer, right? So it was really incredible to see this community develop. And so it took a little while, but I think we're starting to round the corner where that community is they're starting to share back cost optimization stories and things like this, right? So that's kind of been, kind of watching the evolution unfold at my organization, those are really good signs. When you see the community kind of take off on its own and start having cost optimization conversations on their own without someone pushing the issue.
That sounds like a really interesting point you've just made there. I mean, if I've read you right, what we're saying is when your technical guys got their hands on cloud, they were all very excited. There was huge amounts of energy generated, not just energy internally in each individual that was excited to try out a new technology, but almost a collective engineering energy that, hey, you know, we could do something really special with this. So they wanted to share stories about the engineering and technical aspects. How did you get them to sort of, because I mean, clearly there's a risk there that anyone coming in and saying, hey, hold on a minute, what about the costs of all this stuff, might sort of completely ruin that energy. How do you keep the energy and sort of like change its direction so it starts to include cost?
Well, I'd hate to say that. I'd hate to try to take credit for it because I think kind of talking about FinOps. So that's the first thing we did, right? We got our slide presentation together and we kind of read it off to anyone that would listen. I would write blogs and I'd post those. So yeah, we did churn, kind of the conversation. We kind of forced the conversation, but then I think certain aspects of it kind of become an engineering problem to solve, right? So if I'm hoping, what I'm hoping is if you can present the problems as kind of a design and engineering problem to solve, then maybe it's more interesting for your engineer type, right?
Right. So instead of saying, look, costs are too high, you've got to fix them, you go and say, look, how are we going to solve this problem where no one seems to know how much we're spending and what we're spending it on? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I hate to get into too much, but so tagging was another thing, right? So the importance of tagging, I think everyone kind of got it at first, but then with AWS in particular, I don't know if the other providers have challenges like this too, but the tagging is just it differs so much from service to service, and you find all these caveats and little technical problems with it, and yeah, so that was a hard one. It took us a long time to really get the rest of the community on board with that piece, right? But kind of the technical ones where you can dig into a glue job or something like that and try to figure out how to make that more efficient. I think that is that's an engineering problem that they're ready to jump in, right?
So yeah, so that's really good. Now you mentioned tagging there. If you're a FinOps practitioner coming into a situation where the data culture is very much established and you want to start on this journey towards the FinOps culture, is tagging a good place to start, do you think? I mean, I know account hierarchy, the account organization might also be important in cost allocation. What should the first steps look like in this culture journey, do you think?
Yeah. So you definitely want to start at least thinking about tagging from the very, very beginning. And we actually pretty early, we started thinking about tagging, and it was actually before FinOps really started going, right? So we kind of recognized the importance of tagging, and we actually had our IT finance people reach out because they have a showback process where they incorporate all the costs, the labor costs and the software and hardware cost, and then they show that back. And they had a desire to, how do we allocate cloud costs? And I was like, well, tagging, right? So we started kind of working on tagging, but it was kind of slow getting the requirements together and what the values were going to be. We had a couple of missteps in providing information to people that was not what we landed on initially wasn't where we ultimately landed. So there was a couple of pullbacks and changes and things like that. So it kind of took a while to get it going. And as I mentioned before, you won't even imagine the number of technical caveats and little technical issues and defects that you run into with with tagging from service to service until you start trying to get everyone to tag everything that can be tagged. It's a real
Right.
challenge. It really is. And now, you know, we've come a long way with it now, but there's all these challenges that we're dealing with. So that get that started early for sure. And I think I mentioned earlier the evangelizing FinOps. That's going to be important if you're coming into a data center culture, right? Being aware of the things that roll off of people's tongues so easily, like that's a drop in the bucket, or that's just the cost of doing business. You know, those things, those just have to be wiped out of the vernacular again, right? Yeah, in my opinion, because I mean, it may be true in some cases, and you know, we're pretty lenient with users when they, you know, if they say, well, we have this production date and we're really busy, we can address this optimization after Q1 or something like that, right? If they can tell us something like that, good. You know, you've got plans to do something. But yeah, the whole data center culture. So the tendency is going to be, so if you think about it, if you think about on-prem data center culture, a company is always going to lean into having more, if you're considering having enough infrastructure to meet demand and having a well-utilized infrastructure, every organization is always going to lean into having enough for demand, right? And so I think 9 times out of 10, what you end up with is very low utilized infrastructure. So the fact that the infrastructure is pretty low utilized because you're really prepping for demand, it allows organizations to kind of just look the other way at poor utilization. But when you get into cloud, that poor utilization is your low hanging fruit, right? So that's that anyway, you know, because we had a lot of EC2 usage in AWS. And so the first things we really attacked and started reporting on were the trusted advisor notifications for idle instances and right sizing. So those are kind of the first couple of things that we consider to be low hanging fruit started reporting on.
Right. So have you got when you think about right sizing, when you think about the low hanging fruit, the first steps in this culture journey, do you have a sort of specific example in mind from your organization where you maybe had a bunch of EC2 instances that were way underutilized? Maybe the guys that were responsible for them were either unaware of that or were aware of it but didn't think it was that important because the costs seemed quite small. But you were able to sort of change their approach, get the results, and then gradually sort of change their cultural approach, appraisal of that.
Yeah. So I think most people will do the right thing if they're aware of it. I think the tendency coming in is to not look at that. That's not something that they're accustomed to, you know, having to manage, really, frankly. And so it's just not something that they work at. I think the sweet spot when development of your design of your infrastructure is your new task is to just throw something big at it that I know is going to work and I'm not going to have to mess with, right? It's not to really spend a lot of time and tweaking your sizing of your instances and that type of thing. So yeah, I think it's just something that people have to be reminded of over and over. And so we have still the one group that is they're just massive EC2 users. It's a big analytic environment and they use a lot of EMR. And so they have a lot of compute. They use a lot of big, heavy compute and they have a lot of compute expense. They were the worst at the very beginning, but they were just getting rolling. They were trying to get their design down. So they just didn't have time to carve out. So we would look at their numbers and it was like, man, these guys, and then slowly they started pulling it together. And now they're kind of the example that I use when I look at right sizing, when I look at the cost of their environment, and then in comparison to what percentage of that could be right sized. If I look at that kind of stat, they're the example that I use now, right? So now we have our biggest, you know, one of our most mature compute users, our model for how to handle FinOps, you know, from everything from elasticity, I use them as an example, to you know, their right sizing in comparison to their overall cost. they're the model. So that's a really good example. But I think partly that's me harping somewhat, but partly it's just them realizing that that's the right thing to do, and that's how they're going to trim their expenses, and they do it.
And having got that group to make that transition, that sort of cultural shift from let's bang it out there and who cares how big it is, to actually we need to be a bit more careful about this and we need to have some new processes, some new attitudes. Having achieved that with this one group, how important would you say is it for your entire organization to have those champions that you can sort of point to as examples?
So yeah, we have many kind of showcase avenues. We have like a monthly big public cloud showcase that has a wide variety of attendance from sometimes executives, but a lot of leadership all the way down, to developers. And we usually get 600, 700, 800 people on this kind of call,
Wow.
right? Yeah, it's a big community. And then we have a guild monthly meeting where it's kind of maybe more technical. It's more of your builders, your developers, some leadership, right? But mostly it's a more technical one. So and then there's other avenues. So we're starting an onboarding program, and that's kind of our long game in bringing new people in and making sure they start with the right kind of approaches and concepts. So yeah, we have a big community extension kind of arm of our centralized public cloud team, of which the FinOps team is part of. So there's lots of opportunities to get people to share their stories. So another one, and so that's where we bring. I think we brought that one group in to talk about how they did their elasticity. Another group that's one of our most mature. They have a unit metric that's a really good unit metric. So it's a telemetry type application, so they gauge everything by the cost per trip. So customers have the telemetry stuff in the app in their car, and then they gauge their cost by cost per trip. And they actually have an objective where they don't want they don't want to exceed X number of dollars per trip. So they had this really good story where they showed 10 months worth of cost, and they showed their volume increasing because it was like right around COVID and there was no one driving, right? And then they saw how the volume increased by 50 to 75% over a 10-month period. But in that 10-month period time, they also added capabilities to the application, but they also did like 3 or 4 different pretty big optimizations. And so the whole point of the story was, in this 10-month period, their volume went up X, it was like 70% or something like that. And they added capabilities, but because they'd taken some time to optimize, they actually lowered their unit cost to below their objective by the end of that 10 months.
Wow.
And that was a really powerful story. And I was, when they showed it to me, I was like, you guys have to show this, right? So we got them in a couple of meetings. We had like an event, like a summit, where we had sort of a 3-day thing that was full of public cloud type topics, and they told that story there, and I think that was pretty impactful. But for that kind of thing, I think the use case has to be pretty mature to really get to the point where they have that unit metric and they're tracking it and everything. But yeah, that's another sign of that was
that's
a really
a fantastic story. That's
yeah.
a fantastic story, isn't it? So when we look at the culture change challenge, clearly having these champions, these great stories, and this community that engages with that, this sort of organic process of encouragement and motivation is clearly a big factor in accelerating the move to a FinOps culture. But where does governance sit, do you think? Where does all that motivational community stuff sit next to governance, controls, guardrails, and basically mandated pathways that things can and can't happen down?
Yeah, so I guess if I'd look at it kind of a 90-10, or maybe an 85-15 in favor of that culture being driven by governance, right? So I mean, you can get so far with encouragement and that kind of thing, right? But when you really want to see something move, there's got to be some kind of a consequence tied to it, right? So the tagging, I mentioned tagging earlier. So we pushed for a year with tagging as sort of a directive control, right? Telling people what the benefits are, what we're going to use it for, how it would benefit them and everything. And we got a little ways, maybe we were at I think 30% in our production environments of taggable resources that were tagged. And then we published a standard and tied a consequence to that standard, and actively govern that standard. And then in 6 months, we went from that 30% to about 95%.
I'm going to stop you there, Kenny. I'm going to stop you there, because when you started answering that question, after telling me the wonderful things that these two groups had achieved and how the community was pulling around those champions and those examples, I assume when you said this was 90%, 10% in favor of, the next thing was going to be the motivational encouragement change. So you really threw me a curveball when you said 90% in favor of the governance, the controls, the mandatory stuff. So I mean, I think that's really, I guess everybody watching this back would think the same. So it's interesting that from your perspective now, you think that almost the sort of motivational stuff, the community stuff, is the icing on the cake, but the actual cake is about controls and governance.
So yeah, so I guess, we talked a little bit about some of these problems when they become an engineering problem, right? And it's an engineering problem to solve the cost issue. I think that is something that they'll grab and they'll run with that, right? And they'll share what they did back to people. So that stuff, that the whole solving a problem, sharing it back to the community, working cross departments, cross teams, you've got a developer from one team that's totally disconnected from another, helping to solve a problem for that person. That stuff I think is kind of innate to an engineer, right? It's a problem to solve. That's what my mind does. Let's do that. When it comes to something that's like a compliance thing, that's not fun, and then I kind of got into earlier all of the caveats and technical issues with tagging. So once you start digging into that, it's really not something that's very fun, right? It's not a fun problem to solve. Now, maybe you could use some of that engineering principles to solve that problem as well. But when it's kind of set up in a way that is just difficult out of the gate, I think you need a little push with things like governance, to help with that. So that's kind of the approach we've taken from the information security perspective. So you read all these articles about data exposures happening because someone left a bucket unencrypted, right? So the last thing my company wants is to be listed on an article like that. So we put this kind of mandatory encryption in place, and there's a check that goes, and if there's a S3 bucket that's created without encryption, they send a warning. And so once someone has that threat of escalation, they'll do the things that maybe aren't like a fun problem for them to solve, but something that the organization needs them to do that maybe isn't all that sexy, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I'd say 90% of the things we're asking them to do that are compliance are not that sexy, right?
Right.
So.
But it's interesting, because I think if we just throw the word culture out there, I think most people immediately start thinking of the warm, fuzzy human stuff, don't they? They think about culture being, I don't know, you either buy into a culture mentally or you don't buy into a culture. It's sort of like a behavioral thing. Whereas what I'm getting from you, and now when I think about it, you think about, well, okay, look at the Navy SEALs. I mean, there's a culture there. How do you create a culture like that? You don't create a culture like that by putting a bunch of guys together and saying, hey, watch this guy, he's really good. You do it by a sort of quite a detailed training process, don't you, where you put these guys through hell. They develop new skills, they learn things they didn't know before they work as a unit. So in terms of creating that sort of culture, I don't want to make the parallel with the military culture, but it just struck me as an example. Clearly, governance, control, standards. This is the way we do things. You know, this is why it's important to clean your uniform, clean your weapon, do this, don't do that. So I think you could see that controls are actually a key element of
They are.
culture. It's just that that's not the way your brain immediately thinks of culture when the word pops up. Yeah.
Yep. Totally agree. I think that's a great example. So, I mean, we kind of split things into, from a FinOps perspective, a desired behavior versus something that's required. So a desired behavior is one that we'd like to see as much of as, you know, as possible, but we know that it can't just be applied to everyone, right? So for instance, we'd love to see a lot of people using you know, EC2 spot instances, because you get, you know, up to a 95% discount. But just due to the nature of spot, we know there are limits to its usage, and that in reality, the architecture really has to be designed around spot. So we can't mandate the use of spot because we don't know the individual situations of every app out there. But what we've done is we report on it, and we report the usage, the associated savings, and all that at the account level. We share names, we put numbers next to names, in the same way we do kind of your shame back reports with the right sizing opportunities and things like that. So we post that kind of thing, and then more recently we developed kind of this internal custom EC2 metric, and we're using spot savings as a means to improve kind of the scorecard result, right? So if you are using spot, you're going to get X improvement on your EC2 scorecard result, right? So that's maybe another way. Another way we've considered, but we haven't really gotten there yet, is so we're like a Terraform shop, right? We do everything with infrastructure as code. So with Terraform, you can create these reusable modules where people can take and have kind of the bulk of code and then just customize pieces of it for their own use. So we've talked about making spot easier to use by providing modules that would handle the spot requests and whatnot. So that's another way, you know, we look to encourage those. But when we have something that's a required behavior, we know that's going to be something that we can apply to everybody, right? So trying to think of an example of this. So an example of this was we wanted to have everyone to have at least a bucket level lifecycle policy on their S3 buckets. And then we had like 3 or 4 parameters that were required within that. And so that was something I felt was high level enough. It does some cleanup jobs that we were looking to get done. And it can apply to everyone, right? So that's an example of a required behavior. And for that, we have this whole framework where, you know, we have checks and notifications and consequences, right?
Right.
So we kind of look, we do both things. We report and we try to encourage desired behaviors, but we try to bring the governance to the things that we feel are required.
Great. Kenny, that's great. Thanks for talking to me today. That's wonderful.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mike.